In this lecture, we're going to focus on the growth of the American economy in the time period between 1700 and 1800, and we're specifically going to talk about the system of mercantilism in which Great Britain really profited off of its colonies, and also how this led to very unique regional economies, as well as the Industrious Revolution and the Consumer Revolution. And we talk about American economy as a way of both understanding some of the issues between the colonies and their mother country that will eventually spark the American Revolution, and also as a way of understanding how culture and the social lives of colonists change in the 18th century. From the very start, the British colonies didn't necessarily develop with a set plan in mind or with a specific organization. They developed in sort of a haphazard manner. They were settled because of a variety of reasons, such as favorable climate conditions, or just an accident of landing in Plymouth, or the disposition of wealthy private individuals who chose where they wanted to live and then later became the governor or a leading authority in the colony. So there wasn't a whole lot of planning that went into these early settlements and where they ended up setting up shop. If you compare it, the Spanish and the French colonies were a bit more active in directing where they wanted their colonists to set up. And once they had set it up, though, those colonists were very much marginalized and they didn't receive a whole lot of attention from their mother country. All of the original 13 British colonies were private ventures, so they were chartered by the government, but they weren't supervised at all after they were chartered, so they weren't very well supported. Just as long as the colonies could contribute a little bit to the national wealth and economy, and they didn't cost the government as much as they were able to make, then they were allowed to have fairly loose control, and they were allowed to develop with a bit of autonomy and independence. So this leads to a period of a lot of instability at the end of the 17th century because these local colonial governments were really struggling to control their inhabitants, to police their borders, and to establish successful individual economies. And the economy of each colony is going to vary depending on the location and the individuals living there. In a lot of colonies, the elites would vie for control, and then in others, the poor people would rise up and they would rebel against the elite leadership if it was insecure in any way. And we've seen this before when we've discussed Bacon's Rebellion. So as the population expands and aggressive traders push up against native population at the same time, violence really explodes in most of these colonies. Beyond this, the British, the French, and the Dutch, and all of their native allies are going to be colliding during this time period with the French and Indian Wars, which we'll really talk about in a later lecture. So the colonists find themselves caught in and really taking advantage of all of these cross currents that are ongoing. In the middle of the 17th century, the British government was thrown into turmoil, and Parliament and the King struggled at this point over the future direction of the nation, and two issues were really at stake. One of those was religion, and the other was royal power. This sort of uneasy balance that Elizabeth I had established between the Puritans and the Church of England collapsed once she passed away, and her successors took over. That would be James I and Charles I. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, actually moved the Church of England away from the Calvinist belief in predestination, and he brought back worship that was very reminiscent of Catholicism. And remember, after the Protestant Reformation, the people in Britain were not particularly happy with Catholicism. They also began to persecute Puritans, and they prompted a Presbyterian revolt in Scotland as a result. Parliament refused to appropriate the funds that King Charles requested in order to squash this revolt. Instead, in 1628, Parliament passed the Petition of Right, which reasserted such basic freedoms as no taxation except by an act of Parliament, so the king couldn't just arbitrarily tax the people, no arbitrary arrests or imprisonment, and no quartering of soldiers in private homes. The king could not, and the government could not force people to allow soldiers to live in their homes. without their permission. And after years of stalemate in 1642, Charles goes and he raises an army and he moves against Parliament, beginning the English Civil War, which doesn't finish up until 1647, and Parliament is actually victorious. 2 years later, Charles was beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell, who's actually a Puritan, ruled over them as the Lord Protector until he dies in 1658. When Cromwell's son and successor proved to be a fairly inept leader, Charles II was invited to reclaim the crown in 1660. So for all of this time, they were fighting about royal power and who should be in charge, and it was really a result of the fact that they were fighting over religion, over how much of the old Catholic tradition should be allowed again in England. And although the monarchy was restored, its authority had really been diminished. Britain had been transformed into a constitutional monarchy in which the power of the crown was balanced by that of Parliament. So the king couldn't just do whatever he wanted to. He had to have the backing of Parliament, which was typically where the lords would have found their power. Britain also found a middle way between Calvinist Protestantism and Catholicism. When the Catholic King James II tried to fill the government with Catholics and to rule without the consent of Parliament, he was removed in a bloodless revolution that we'll talk about later on, called the Glorious Revolution. And while all of this is going on, after the reassertion of Parliament authority in 1688, the British state really becomes increasingly strong and centralized, and Britain starts to embark on a course that makes it the world's most powerful nation by the early 19th century. And in so doing, it changes the entire economy of the colonies. It's really at this point that a policy of mercantilism becomes enforced in the colonies. And mercantilism is based on the idea that for a nation to build up its economic strength, it needs to actually export more than it imports. And in order to achieve a favorable balance of trade, the British would pass regulatory laws benefiting the British economy only. They created a trade system in which the colonist would provide the raw materials or goods to Britain, and Britain would then take those raw goods and create manufactured goods from them, and then they would sell those in the European markets and back to the colonies as well as to people in Africa and to South America. And so in passing their regulatory laws, they were able to ensure that the colonists traded only with England. Mercantilism is also known as the triangle trade system, and you can see from some of these diagrams that the way it would work is that in places like Boston, they would harvest whale oil, lumber, and furs, and in other areas like in the South and Charleston especially, they would be able to harvest rice and silk, indigo, and tobacco. In the Caribbean, they would create sugar and molasses and wood, and then they would take all of these raw goods and they would ship them back over to England. And England would then create manufactured goods and luxury items, and over to Africa they would send things like guns and cloth and iron and beer. And in return, they got from Africa gold and ivory and spices and hardwoods. And then Africa would send over to North America rum and iron and gunpowder and cloth and tools, and of course slaves, especially into the Caribbean islands, even more than into the Americas. And then from there, the slaves and the sugar and the molasses would make their way from the Caribbean up into the port towns of Charlestown and New York and Philadelphia and Boston. And so it essentially made a triangle throughout the entire Atlantic Ocean. The British really believed that the chief purpose of all of their colonies was to serve the mother country, and mercantilism was essentially developed in order to facilitate the consolidation of these new European nation-states. So these states required vast sums of money to support their growing military and also their bureaucracies, and the mercantilists considered the economy and politics a zero-sum game, as one side's gain was another side's loss. So if they could take money or profit away from one country, then that would automatically benefit them. At this point, wealth was pretty much exclusively found in hard species, so that's gold and silver. And because there was a finite amount of gold and silver in the world, the nations would try to capture and take a share of other nations' money in order to improve their own standing in the hierarchy of countries. Therefore, mercantilism is really the heart of this cutthroat rivalry between the nations in the colonial time period. And this rivalry is really what caused the British government to start passing a series of trade regulations in order to ensure that the Dutch and the Spanish and the French didn't pay the colonists more for their goods or use some other form of trickery to take what the British believed were the goods of the mother country. And in fact, it's going to be these trade regulations that are eventually going to pave the way to American independence. The very first and probably one of the most important of the British trade regulations was the Navigation Act of 1651, and there are several important features of this act. First of all, it said that all trade in the empire had to be conducted in ships that were either British or owned by British colonists, and that the crews on these ships had to be at least half Englishmen or half colonists. And this succeeded really in stimulating the growth of the British merchant marine, and also in creating the shipping industry as really the leading industry in New England. But oftentimes, if the colonists didn't want to follow this regulation, especially because the crown didn't enforce it very well for quite some time, they would just turn to smuggling. And some of our founding fathers later on in the 18th century, such as John Hancock, would actually turn to smuggling and sometimes were caught smuggling. The other thing that the Navigation Act said is that there were certain enumerated goods, and these were goods, a list of goods such as raw products like tobacco and sugar and indigo, and it said that any of these enumerated goods that came from foreign countries, they couldn't just go directly to the colonists and sell them for a low price. Instead, these foreign countries had to go to England first, and once they reached the British ports, the British would actually tax them, and so after leaving those ports, they would have to hike up the prices on their goods in order to make their money back. And so it really would influence the colonists to not purchase items that weren't made in England. So the whole point of this enumerated goods list was to make sure that the colonists were buying British. The other thing that the Navigation Act did was to give subsidies of certain goods, and a subsidy is a benefit given by the government to groups or individuals, usually in the form of a cash payment or a tax reduction, and the subsidy is usually given to remove some type of burden. It's often considered to be in the interest of the public, and these subsidies would be for things like linen and gunpowder and silks, and they wanted to allow British manufacturers to undersell European counterparts. The last thing that the Navigation Act did is that it prohibited colonists from making wool, felt hats, and iron on a large scale, and they did this because they wanted the colonists to only be harvesting raw materials, and they wanted the British to be the ones who made the final manufactured product, and so they were in essence protecting English manufacturers. But on the other hand, slowly, these trade regulations, once they step up and increase later on in the 1730s and 40s and 50s, they're going to start to anger the colonists who begin to question why they can't create their own manufactured items and why they can't also have economic success. Eventually, the colonists began to realize just how restrictive this mercantilism policy was. By the time we get to the late 1760s, the colonists are importing 4 million pounds a year, and almost all of those imports are coming from Great Britain. Most of the imports are manufactured goods rather than raw materials, and they're goods that couldn't have been made in America, especially when they were on the list of goods that couldn't be produced based on those earlier navigation acts. A lot of the goods like ironware and sugar and hats that they brought into the colonies were actually made from materials that came from the colonies in the first place, and had they had the capacity to create the manufactured goods, they would have spent far less money supplying themselves. The colonists actually imported more goods than they exported. And remember that the policy of mercantilism was that for a country to be successful, they needed to export more than they imported. So the colonial economy was not successful for the colonist, it was successful for the mother country. And the earnings from the shipping fees and payments from the British government for military expenses would then make up the difference between their imports and their exports. But despite this fact, the colonial economy ran a deficit of about £40,000 by the late 1760s, and a lot of the wealthiest planters in these colonies lived on credit, and the credit would constantly be extended by the British merchants because they really thrived in this system of mercantilism. But anytime there was an international crisis, the creditors would call in their debts that were owed to them, and the colonists would realize, oh my goodness, we depend so much on these goods as well as on the credit that's given to us by England, and in cases where they couldn't pay them back, there could be real trouble, because while you can't go to prison in most cases today for your debt, that wasn't the case back in the colonial era. So it became increasingly problematic. Although distinctions of wealth emerged almost immediately in American society, especially in the cities, the relative abundance of land in the 17th century allowed many rural colonists to own their own land. This was a goal that was almost unattainable in Europe, where the aristocracy owned most of the land. Even in cities, those without a farmstead generally earned higher wages than they would have in Europe because labor commanded a higher price in the colonies, where skilled craftsmen were much rarer. Although all of these facts contributed to the prosperity of the colonists, population growth, natural increase in immigration, and the dwindling availability of land became serious problems by the mid-18th century. In the colonies' expanding cities, the gulf between the rich and the poor widened, and in rural areas, young people faced the prospect that they might not be able to obtain land for their own farms. The population of British North America expanded rapidly in the 18th century. Between 1700 and 1750, the white population of the colonies rose from about 250,000 to more than 1,000,000. In contrast to America's first predominantly English colonists who arrived in the early 1600s, 18th century immigrants varied in national origin and ethnic identity. As the chart here illustrates, the colonies attracted settlers from elsewhere in Britain, including Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Immigration from the European continent also included many Dutch and Germans. The decision to immigrate to America was a momentous one. The financial and personal costs of immigration could demand heavy sacrifices. The transatlantic crossing, which could take 4 months, meant enduring cramped conditions on a ship with few amenities. Additionally, the cost of the transatlantic passage was well beyond the yearly wages of the average Englishman, and even more expensive for those from the European continent. To finance their passage, many immigrants, men and women alike, contracted to work as indentured servants. In exchange for having their passage paid, these servants agreed to work for a specified number of years, usually 7. In some cases, the indenture system separated family members, with husband and wife indenturing themselves to different families in order to survive. As a result of the growing importance of mercantilism on the colonies, each of them began to develop a regional economy that was unique to that area, and the economy depended on lots of different factors such as the location and the soil quality for growing different crops. And if we start in New England, the sea had really always been central to New England's economy, but beginning in the 18th century, the maritime economy really expanded dramatically. And while they continued to supply fish to their domestic and their foreign markets, they also became a major center of shipbuilding, and the merchants carried out a lively trade in lots of different commodities. The Yankee trade of spirits was probably one of the most important. And by spirits, I mean alcohol, such as an amber-colored dessert wine called Madeira. It came from a Portuguese island group. And also rum, which was distilled from molasses and that was procured in the Caribbean, became really vital to New England's commercial economy. And over time, the elite class, which had been mostly ministers, began to be supplanted by a rising merchant class in New England. The Mid-Atlantic region, which includes New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware colonies, was the most ethnically diverse region in the colonies, and the hubs of New York and Philadelphia were home to a whole host of ethnic and religious groups, and these two big cities became centers of commerce and finance. Each city boasted a thriving port, facilitating trade with Europe and coastal trade with other ports in the Atlantic world, and agricultural products from rural Pennsylvania and Delaware were sold in the markets of Philadelphia. It's probably most important that wheat came out of the mid-Atlantic and made its way over to England, because England was experiencing turmoil from warfare as well as some crop insufficiencies when it came to wheat, and so they helped to keep the population stabilized in England. Also, New York's Hudson River carried agricultural products from upriver farms and furs from northern New York, and the Mid-Atlantic region had small manufacturing enterprises, and these included flour milling, lumbering, mining, and metal foundries. The region really depended on indentured servants for most of its labor. Between 1700 and 1775, about 1,000 servants came from the British Isles, and another 35,000 from German-speaking regions on the European continent. The South was the region that was most closely tied to slave labor. Actually, it was two distinct regions, the Upper South, or the Chesapeake region, and the Lower South, including parts of South Carolina and the Georgia Low Country. And each of them produced different cash crops and employed slave labor in much different ways. Immigration into the two regions varied, and the ethnic composition of the Upper and the Lower South was also quite different. Although more ethnically diverse than New England, the Upper South, areas of Virginia and Maryland, tied to the Chesapeake, drew immigrants mostly from England and Scotland. The planter elite who dominated this region built their fortune on tobacco grown on plantations with slave labor. And in fact, it was John Rolfe who first experimented with the growing of tobacco. And you might recognize his name because he was in the story of Pocahontas. He was in the Disney movie Pocahontas 2, because he actually married Pocahontas and brought her back to England before she passed away. And he was in fact the one who showed the people living in the Chesapeake just how good of a crop this could be, and also who popularized it in the Americas as well as in the Old World. The Lower South was settled later than the Chesapeake, and it benefited more from the growth of immigration and was more religiously diverse than the Upper South. In addition to Anglicans, the region included Presbyterians, German Moravians, Baptists, and Quakers, and they mostly focused on the growing of rice and indigo, and the damp, hot climate of this low country bred a lot of diseases. In order to avoid these conditions, for much of the year, the wealthiest planters preferred to take second homes in Charleston, which became a major cultural and economic center of the region. And before it was named Charleston, it was called Charlestown. Because of the kind of crops that were grown, as well as the extreme reliance on slave labor, plantations were fairly unique to the Chesapeake and southern regions. The very first ones were typically built along a river, just like you see in this illustration, and it was used as a highway to transport crops to market and goods to the plantation. Each one of these plantations would have had their own dock for loading and unloading boats, and if a plantation wasn't lucky enough to be located on a river, it was connected by a road to another plantation that was. Money was rarely used in the southern colonies, and instead, crops would be traded in a bartering system. Crop buyers would travel up and down the southern waterways with their boats filled with British-made goods, and the planters would then trade their own tobacco, rice, and indigo for things like shoes and lace and thread, farm tools, and dishes. And some of these very large plantations didn't sell their own crops. Planters of a very large and successful plantation instead sold their crops through a broker in Britain. And a broker is a person who's paid to buy and sell for someone else. And the planters sent their crops to Britain with a list of things they wanted the broker to buy for them. The broker would then sell the crops and bought what the planter wanted and then would send those goods back to the colonies. So when you look at this illustration here, the main building at the top is the planter's house, which might also in the 19th century be referred to as the big house. And then the servants and the slaves would have lived nearby in the smaller quarters here. And kitchens usually are going to be separate from that big house or the planter's house because of the danger of fire. And then you'll see little sheds that would have stored the crops and livestock kept in the barns, of course. So each plantation also had down at the bottom, you'll see a blacksmith and a laundry, and they're all economically self-sufficient. And in many ways, they are a microcosm of the larger colonial society. They're run by the same patriarchal institutions that enable white privilege in the ruling families. In the early 17th century, most of the colonists really hugged the coastline, places like Plymouth, as well as Massachusetts Bay, and then later on the colonies down the eastern seaboard. But by the time you get into the 18th century, they start pushing westward into areas like the interior of the Carolinas, western Pennsylvania, and also western Virginia. And a lot of the new immigrants headed directly for the back country. In particular, the Scots-Irish were attracted to the back country of Pennsylvania and also the Carolinas, and in fact they settled in very large numbers here in Mecklenburg County. The back country lacked a lot of the refinements of the older, more settled regions of the colonies, and it led the travelers from Europe to compare backcountry colonists to Native Americans, and often in their journals and their diaries they described them as being savages, both the natives as well as the backcountry colonists. And in fact, if you remember from our lecture on the history of sexuality and marriage, because of the common law marriage tradition of jumping the broom that existed in the backcountry in the Carolinas, many of the visitors looked quite disapprovingly at our colonists. But whatever their similarities, relations between the backcountry whites and natives were generally strained, and rather than seeking to trade with the indigenous people and to learn their ways, the Scots-Irish wanted to create farmsteads which required displacing the native people, and the simmering tension between the residents of the backcountry region and the local tribes would erupt in violence throughout the 18th century. And backcountry settlers farmed, hunted, and raised livestock for their own consumption and local trade, and they weren't really connected to that burgeoning Atlantic economy that was growing. The economic realities of life in the backcountry encouraged independence and a strongly egalitarian culture. Courts were rare, and so were tax officials or other representatives, either of the colonial or the British government, and a visitor to this region would also have noted a lack of churches, primary schools, and institutions of higher education. So there actually would have been a great deal of both economic and political autonomy for these backcountry colonists. Although most Americans lived in the countryside during the 18th century, cities were growing. Philadelphia boasted 23,000 residents by 1760, making it the largest city in the colonies. Still, America was far less urban than either Europe or the Spanish colonies to the south. Compared to London, with more than 700,000 people, Philadelphia was tiny, and Spanish America had half a dozen cities larger than Philadelphia. Mexico City, for example, had more than 100,000 inhabitants by the mid-18th century. But the growth rates of the cities of colonial British America were impressive. Boston, for example, doubled in size between 1700 and 1760. Larger towns such as Albany, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and Baltimore, Maryland became regional centers. Throughout these urban areas, 18th century society became polarized along economic lines. The percentage of wealth owned by the richest Americans increased. In Boston and Philadelphia, 5% of the population had amassed almost half of their city's wealth by the last quarter of the 18th century. At the same time, the number of the urban poor also rose dramatically in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The chart here illustrates the dramatic climb in the amount of money Boston devoted to poor relief from the mid-century onward. During the same period, many trades and crafts established their own mutual benefit societies to help the poor. The stark inequality between the lives of the destitute and those of Boston's wealthiest merchants who lived in fine new mansions and traveled around the city in elegant coaches grew more pronounced, especially in the 1770s. By the mid-18th century, many Americans living in the countryside or in small towns in most of the settled regions of the colonies confronted a scarcity of land. The problem Connecticut's colonists faced illustrates the interconnected issues of population growth and land scarcity. Between 1720 and 1760, Connecticut's population more than doubled, from 59,000 to 142,000. Beginning in the 1740s, children faced the prospect that their parents would not have enough land to help them establish their own farms when they became adults. Many sons and daughters delayed marriage until they could acquire a farmstead and establish their own independent household. Others moved to nearby towns. Many of Connecticut's young adults went as far as northern New Hampshire, and others headed to most western parts of New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, or the Carolinas. Finally, some families simply postponed their dreams of independence, working as tenants on another farmer's land as they struggled to save enough money to purchase their own farms. As trade expanded with Britain, the colonists strove to emulate the culture and the sophistication of the mother country. And in order to do this, while these regional economies were forming, there was also an industrious revolution that was taking place. Now note that the term is industrious revolution and not industrial revolution, which happens later in the 19th century. During the Industrious Revolution, people start working harder, and they organize their households to produce goods for sale so that they would have money to pay for the items that they wanted, such as those luxury goods from England. So the family had always been the basic economic unit of the colonies, and there had always been a gendered division of labor that we've talked about previously. When people decided to begin producing goods to sell at the marketplace, they not only changed the face of the colonies by seeing the growth of cities, but they also changed their family economies. And in a lot of ways, men's and women's work was quite complementary. So, for example, when it came time to make cider, the men would be the ones who would plant the apple trees, and then the children would pick those apples, and the women would make them into cider. The whole family worked together. Another good example of this would be the role of women as a deputy husband. When the father or the husband must step away from his responsibilities, the woman continues her own tasks and takes on his as well. So during this industrious revolution and during the 18th century, the difference between men's work and women's work is that men would have been raising grain and maintaining pastures. They would have cleared land and chopped the wood for fuel, built and maintained the house, the barn, and other structures, and taken the crops to market. Women, on the other hand, would be responsible for childcare and reproductive duties, of course, preparation of food as well as clothing, taking care of the home, growing vegetables and herbs and providing dairy products, and transforming flax and wool into clothing by spinning. So while colonial Americans had always worked hard, at this point they began working even harder in order to have that extra income so that they weren't just sustaining and getting by, but they were actually able to purchase those goods that they desired, and not necessarily that they needed, just that they wanted. In many ways, the increased production of the Industrious Revolution came from the labor of women and children who worked even harder and longer than ever before. They would get up extremely early in the morning, and once all of their daytime jobs were finished and dinner had been put away, they would then find other supplemental jobs they could do to create extra income for the family. So they might grow fruits and vegetables or create products to sell in the marketplace. Churning butter, for example, is no easy task. Making soap out of the fat that they had left over from cooking, and also creating candles for sale. And another good example of this is that women took part in something called the putting out system. And this system would supply individual workers at home with the materials that they needed to complete one stage of a craft. And this was often done with shoemaking. It didn't pay very well, but it did fit into their daily domestic chores. It was something that they could do when they found a moment or two of extra time each day, and it provided supplemental income to the family. So there really wasn't a whole lot of downtime for either men or women in the colonial era who were working constantly to achieve a better status. As a result of this industrious revolution, some families began to have more disposable income, and as a result, this led to the consumer revolution, which was a steady increase in the demand by colonists for consumer goods and also the purchase of these consumer goods with this new income. And although the income really only went up slightly in the 18th century, people began buying far more. They created a consumer society in which people purchased goods. And you see this when you look at the difference between a house in the early colonial period and the late colonial period. Houses often were just one room in the early period, and they had maybe a kitchen table and a bed if you were lucky. If not, you might have a pallet, and there would have been some chairs around the kitchen table and maybe a stool by the fireplace, and that would have been it. And if you compare this to the picture above, you see a man reclining in a chair with a table next to him, and he's got glasses, and he's drinking obviously something, and he's got a nice couch behind him and a nice patterned rug underneath him, and you see paintings along the walls as well, and that the walls have been painted. So they're spending this extra income on items of lasting value, like tablecloths and bed linens that they'll pass on to their children, and that can even become a part of a woman's dowry. In the 18th century colonies, they bought more clothing made from cheaper material, and it was less durable fabric, but for the first time they could afford to have more than 2 or 3 outfits in a year. And these new pieces of furniture that they bought could be used to store their garments. Acquiring such goods allowed individuals and families to demonstrate that they were not simple provincials or from the back country. They were part of a wider cosmopolitan world, and rather than eat with simple earthenware ceramics as their forebears had, the wealthiest Americans now aspired to dine on fine porcelain imported from England or Holland. And people began to care more about how they appeared to each other. Ordinary people cared about following the standards of a new style of life. Their refined taste was proof of gentility, and this is a term that became synonymous with the attributes associated with wealth and sophistication. People of the gentility were polite, civilized. They were refined and fashionable. They opposed vulgarity and could use only certain types of objects. And American society underwent this process of Anglicanization, which simply means that the colonists wanted to emulate English society in as many ways as possible, including its taste in furniture, food, clothing, and even customs. Nothing better captured the rise of gentility and the increasing Anglicization of colonial America than the rage for imported tea. As the consumption of tea increased dramatically between the end of the 1600s and the dawn of the 1700s, the rituals of serving tea became more refined and more complicated. Serving tea to one's guests became essential. Although tea drinking started among the wealthy, it gradually spread to all levels of American society. By the mid-18th century, tea drinking had evolved from a luxury to a necessity, so much that inmates in the Philadelphia poorhouse demanded that their meager rations include tea. For wealthy colonists, nothing was more effective at communicating one's riches and gentility than a formal portrait in the latest English style. Following the conventions of European portraits, men and women struck standard aristocratic poses, elegant ladies dressed in flowing gowns mimicking the style of their monarch, Queen Anne. Men and even young boys were painted wearing elegant outfits that reflected their wealth, status, and power. The picture that you see here is a portrait of young Henry Darnall III, painted by Justice Inglehart Kuhn in 1710, and it reveals how the aspirations of colonists continued to exceed the bounds of the possible. Although the Darnalls lived a life of luxury compared with most colonists, surrounding themselves with goods that earlier generations would have envied, they did not quite live up to the standards of the typical British aristocrat. The scene behind Darnall is pure fantasy. An elegant stone balustrade overlooking an elaborate formal garden projects an image of wealth, refinement, and power. Yet neither the fancy garden nor the stone balcony would have existed anywhere in the colonies at the time. The artist's decision to include these imaginary elements in the background reflected the aspirations rather than the realities of life in the colonies. The picture symbolized the wealth, power, and gentility that the Darnalls sought to achieve, not their actual condition. The work is also the first known painting of an African American in the colonies. Darnall's slave wears a silver yoke around his neck, a symbol of his inferior status. Although much younger, he towers over his slave. The exteriors of American houses also underwent a process of Anglicization. English-style manor houses, such as William Byrd's Westover, often borrowed ideals from English pattern books, which were just architectural guidebooks of the latest styles. The main entrance of this elegant red brick mansion would take guests through a very impressive doorway that Byrd had imported from England. The model for the door and its frame came from a London design. The classic columns and the swan-shaped broken pediment at the top of the door frame include a carved pineapple. This exotic West Indian fruit created a sensation among the wealthy on both sides of the Atlantic as both a culinary delicacy and as a symbol of affluent hospitality. The pineapple soon became a common architectural motif in the mansions of wealthy Americans. The impact of the consumer revolution is that, first of all, it allowed a greater division of class and evidence of these divisions in the colonies, and it lets this newfound and growing middle class as well as the upper class distinguish themselves from the lower classes through the items that they purchase and the way that they live. And over time, they began to associate the lower class with being their inferiors. Women, in particular, were key players in this pursuit of status, and the proper use of these domestic goods, which was learned and taught by women to their daughters, became just as important as acquiring them. And in doing so, they're not just experimenting with these trappings of gentility, but they're actually creating new identities for themselves and their family, and also new forms of social mobility. So while class divisions and distinctions are increasing, on the other hand, the consumer revolution also could be said to encourage social mobility, because anyone could learn to put aside vulgarity and become genteel. They weren't aristocratic. They were simply wealthy. You didn't need land and a title to become genteel. So this American myth of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and creating something out of nothing is really born in this time period. Ordinary men and women and servants and even slaves start to think it's their right to spend their own money as they please. And it rests on this new system of production that will eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution and the creation of a full working and middle class. And then the last important impact of the consumer revolution is that it really encouraged sociability. People throughout the Atlantic world began to cultivate this new social life. So, for example, matching sets of tableware and chairs underscored the symbolic equality of all of the guests that would come to their gatherings, and you would find more and more families hosting parties and large galas and events in the colonies. Life in the 17th century American colonies, even for the wealthiest, was crude and primitive. But because of changes in the economy as evidenced by the growth of mercantilism, the Industrious Revolution, and the Consumer Revolution, beginning in the 18th century, a more cosmopolitan and refined culture started to emerge, and prosperous colonists sought out the latest British and European consumer goods, such as finely woven Turkish or English carpets, tea sets, and pattern books of English architectural and furniture styles. Books and newspapers and letters all were part of the expanding commerce of the Atlantic world. This economy included a lively exchange of ideas on a wide array of subjects, including architecture, fashion, politics, religion, science, and philosophy. And in many ways, it's going to pave the way towards the American Revolution, because on the one hand, the conflicts between the mother country of Great Britain and the colonies due to some of their trade regulations will end up angering the colonists, and on the other hand, this growth in ideas about politics and religion and science, as evidenced by the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, will have a hand in leading to revolutionary rhetoric that causes the colonists to ultimately rebel and to establish an independent country.